Hi, I'm attorney Greg Dell, joined by attorney Stephen Jessup, and we're going to talk about a resolved case we recently had against Metlife Insurance Company. And Steve, this was for a Google employee. We've represented a lot of Google employees, especially becoming one of the world's bigger employers. And usually the Google employees are high wage earners, which makes these cases even more substantial not because it's any more important than someone who doesn't have a much higher dollar benefit amount, but the insurance companies tend to put a lot more scrutiny on a higher dollar benefit amount because they're in business to make money. And if they can deny someone who has a higher benefit amount versus denying people who have lower dollar amounts, it's something that they may be more interested in doing. But in these videos, we like to talk about why the claimant was denied, what their occupational duties were, and what we were able to do to help convince Metlife in this particular case that this claimant is disabled and, hey, Metlife, you got it wrong and need to pay this claimant. So let's talk about the history of this claim.
Yeah, so my client, he was a former security sales specialist for Google, going into corporations and whatnot and selling them on security services that Google offer for their, all their information, all that type of stuff. So very high-end work. And you are right, his monthly benefit is very large, and that's always going to place extra scrutiny on the claim. His situation goes back to October or September of 2022, where he had a bilateral lung transplant.
Wow.
Yes, and this guy he's so go get it. He was back to work within 3 months.
After bilateral
Yes.
lung transplant?
Within 3 months was already back to work trying to go through. He was able to push through to the best of his ability, but by October of 23, so a little over a year after the transplant and less than a year back to work, he filed for disability. Even as part of the claim itself, there was the performance reviews about how his performance since being sick has dropped off dramatically. His ability to focus, concentrate, general stamina and energy, those types of things were really, really, notified is low on his performance review. So he filed his claim with Metlife, and they originally did approve his claim for benefits.
And for how long did Metlife pay him his benefits?
They started paying in April of 24, and they were denying the case by July of 2025.
And so can you talk about what the basis was for Metlife's denial?
Yeah, Metlife, sometimes they'll get doctors involved in the reviews. In this one, it was just two internal nurses, one to look at the aspect of the lung transplant and how he's doing from a physical, and then a licensed social worker to look at the mental health sides of it. And both of those, reviewers basically just came to a indication that, well, everything's stabilized with the lung transplant. There's really no evidence of a continued impairment in functional ability, so he's fine there, and that the mental health aspect wasn't severe enough to justify benefits, under those provisions.
I'm somewhat cringing as you tell me that, we have a claimant working with Google earning in excess of 250,000 plus, I think
Mhm.
over $300,000 a year for this particular client. And you tell me that Metlife, who's a multi-billion-dollar entity, is relying upon a nurse to examine him? Or
No, just do a review, not just a nurse, but their own employee nurse, just to do reviews of the records.
so how could they do such a bare minimum review when someone who had such a complex medical issue as a bilateral lung transplant?
The real reason, I don't know. What I always believe in these types of situations is, when I spoke to him initially, like the why for him to understand, and I always go to what, ultimately what a litigation would look like in a case like this. And more importantly, not getting into those details, what's the financial cost to the insurance company for it? If they end up losing in court, they may only have to pay the money that's owed, right? There's no damages, there's no extra money. So take the shot, and especially on the initial denial, do it on the cheap and see if the person puts up a fight, right? Are they going to go appeal? And then during the course of the appeal, that's when they'll start to get more medical doctors involved so they can build up the strength of their case. I think, with MetLife and a lot of the insurance companies, it's just a matter of, poking and prodding because they can get away with it. There's no financial repercussion for it to them. So they'll do the bare minimum at times just to deny a case. And I think a lot of times to see if the person will put up a fight.
Yeah, but this is
This is bad. Not only that, so they denied him in July of 25. February 2025, Social Security approves him. In January, March, In May, he had multiple day hospitalizations from pneumonia and sickness from, the transplant. Like there's always going to be those issues. He's more susceptible where he's going to he's hospitalized for days on end because he's sick. It's all lung related sickness. His doctors with regards to the immunosuppressants he have to take and how those affect cognition. And even the research his doctor provided that, upwards of 70% or more of lung transplant recipients have cognitive problems that are either related to the transplant, the medication, or a combination thereof. So there's all this information that not only physically in a compromised state, so I mean, he's constantly getting sick and going into the hospital. His doctor said because of the constant hospitalizations, he's weakened. His body's just weak, and then arguing with regards to the cognitive side. Now, he did have some cognitive testing done that was somewhat inconclusive, but they also, like we know, the problem with neuropsychological testing at times, it's always going to be biased for a neurological basis. So where there was issues of decline and where things could be pointed out, I think it couldn't be definitive enough, and that allowed a road for the insurance company to say, oh, and your doctor said that after 6 months on this, you should be doing better, like the standard medical literature following it. So it was just a really nasty, denial. It was bare bones and brutal.
All right. Well, fortunately, under the rules of ERISA, which the Google
Mhm.
policies are governed by ERISA because it was an employer provided benefit, the claimant had not only the right, but the obligation to appeal back to MetLife. And fortunately, the way the system works is the claimant was going to get a new review by a totally different person and a totally different set of medical experts. So, what did you do to present an appeal that would convince MetLife to reinstate benefits for this claimant?
Yeah, first and foremost, in getting the claim file, so that's, everything you've submitted or they've created, they have to turn that over. And more importantly for me, getting those medical reviews that were done and seeing where the holes could be poked in them based on the medical records that existed contemporaneous, right? Or what their opinions are showing how the medical records don't support that. He also had two providers that were incredibly supportive. Like you said, he is a high wage earner at Google, so he went to top-notch doctors, and top-notch doctors do not take kindly to nurses saying they don't know what they're talking about. So, getting statements from his doctors, additional questionnaires, and then the one thing we built up more than anything, because it wasn't really well documented, was the mental health side of it. Getting, records that they didn't have, because he was also of the impression that his claim was predicated on the lung transplant, so that's all that they could consider, and it's educating him that, no, anything that's wrong, medically speaking, is something that can be considered. So working with his therapist, to get wonderful questionnaires about the interplay between what his symptoms are, how they would impact how he did his job for Google, and then more broadly, in the national economy standard that MetLife uses, and just really trying to target as much as we could. We couldn't really rely heavily on the standardized neuropsychological
Right.
testing, and it was done so recently to the denial, couldn't repeat it. So it was going through the aspects of that testing, and then, quite honestly, the documentation in the medical records about these consistent complaints. And then, in things like lung transplants, there's a lot of literature out there. So finding articles and research studies about cognitive effects following transplants, what the anti-rejection medication, side effects of all that. So really trying to paint a more comprehensive picture and get around this just dumb idea that, well, oh, you got your lung transplant, so you should be fine now.
You mentioned these questionnaires, but what you didn't highlight on is how these were custom questionnaires that you artfully crafted specific to this particular claimant and specific to the language within the disability policy as to what had to be proven. And also a little bit of the strategy about, because I think it's one of the best things that we do as a law firm, it are these custom physician statements, because a lot of claimants don't realize that if they were to do their own appeal and they lose the appeal and they come to us to file a lawsuit, sure, we handle those all the time. But at that point in time, we are married to only what had been submitted within their appeal up until the point in time that MetLife or whoever their company is made a final decision. So much so that if they were to say, hey, the insurance company made a final decision, they denied me yesterday, but today I had such a major accident, I lost both of my legs. It's extreme, right? But of
Mhm.
course, the point is to say, well, you cannot even get into a record before a judge when a lawsuit's filed that you lost both of your legs. There's no obligation on them to consider it. Not only that, they're not allowed to consider it under the law. So everything and anything that could be done has to be done during that appeal. And if you don't do it and don't do it strategically, it's making it that much harder for you to win this case later on. So what we have become almost specialists in is the art of shaping an attending physician statement, almost to the point where it's like as if we're deposing the doctor to get every single word in from the doctor. Because as you know, the doctor's not able to come in and talk. It's ridiculous that the law is like this. The doctor's not able to come in. The judge can't question the doctor. The judge can't question their doctors. We can't question their doctors. So the trial is happening during the appeal. But yet the law makes it in such a way that claimants are supposed to be their own lawyers.
Well, it's even Metlife will send you a denial letter. It's like a one-page form that you fill out for your appeal. And a lot of people just fill that out and it's like, it's nothing. And they submit that as the appeal, with no indication of what the ramifications of doing that, are. Because the biggest aspect of any claim is the medical documentation,
Right.
and then filling in the gaps of what information is needed and try to hash out the things, and like you said, doctors don't testify, no one does. That's the world we live in. So then we have to use that to our advantage where we can. And that sometimes is stoking the fire of the doctor. Like I said, hey, doc, by the way, you can't testify, you can't be deposed. This nurse says, you don't know what you're talking about, guy who does lung
Right.
transplants, have at it. So you're able, I think, sometimes to get the doctors really fired up to come strong with what their responses will be.
And it's also really hard for a claimant on their own to get that kind of attention from the doctor, then articulate the manner in which the doctor needs to communicate back to the insurance company.
And I find a lot of times with clients, that's an awkward conversation they don't want to have to try to have with the doctor.
Right.
Like they almost feel guilty. So I always tell them, lawyers, just let the lawyer handle it. The doctor will be like, lawyers, and we handle doing that.
Well, congratulations on the outcome of this. I know that the benefits were reinstated, a substantial dollar amount and past due benefits were paid. And now moving forward, you continue to monitor the claim on behalf of the claimant and make sure that he's getting the appropriate medical treatment, that the medical records are being documented appropriately. And every couple months, we ask the claimant, send us your medical records, you review them. The claimant statements come in, the attending physician statements come in. You're involved in filling out all of those things so that this claimant, but for getting to the point where he feels he could return to work, will have the appropriate medical support and documentation so that MetLife can't say, you don't have documentation to support your disability. So congrats on this outcome. If you're someone out there who has a MetLife short or long-term disability insurance claim, feel free to reach out to Stephen Jessup, myself, or any of our lawyers. No matter where you live in the country, we are available to assist you, and we'll always provide you with an initial phone consultation.